Hi all, happy Monday. Welcome to The Wife of Caesar. My name is Michel Levien, or Michel Levien, either's fine. As you know, The Wife of Caesar is Streiner's project to talk about corruption or anti-corruption using words that everybody can understand so that we can fight corruption in our day-to-day lives with a little bit more than just good intentions. Every show we have a piece of news, a case, and a typology, and today's news has to deal with Julius Bär. Now, Julius Bär is a bank, a Swiss bank, and you probably have heard of Swiss banks in movies and in the news as some sort of obscure tool that bad people use to launder money. That, Swiss banks are mainly used by villains to hide their stolen assets. And that's mostly true. Obviously, Hollywood tends to embellish, but that's mostly true. And this is one of those situations where a Swiss bank has behaved so poorly that the Swiss authorities themselves have to sanction it. Okay, now FINMA, which is Switzerland's authority, banking and financing regulating authority, essentially a government office, a government authority that is in charge of overseeing and supervising banks and financial institutions, has imposed on Julius Bär several sanctions, the most major of which consists of prohibition from performing major acquisitions, which doesn't sound like much of a punishment, but to a financial institution like Bär, it's quite big. Now, between the years 2009 and 2018, Julius Bär was allegedly involved in several schemes concerning money laundering. The most notable of which have to deal with Ukraine and Venezuela. Now, what happened with Ukraine, you might remember, is that Mr. Viktor Yanukovych had the decency to essentially bankrupt the country with his corrupt deeds. He and his cronies spent so lavishly that they essentially rendered Ukraine bankrupt. Lovely people, by the way. Now, these public officials decided to launder their money via Switzerland, via Swiss banks or other banks in lightly regulated jurisdictions. And among those banks was Julius Bär. Same thing, or a very similar thing, happened with Petróleos de Venezuela, which is, as you might recall, the state-owned entity, the company that the government of Venezuela owns, and which is in charge of extracting and manufacturing oil products. Several employees of Petróleos de Venezuela, which is again a state-owned entity, decided to embezzle money. Now, let's back up a little bit. Whenever you work for a state-owned entity, a company owned by the government, you become automatically a public official because the owner is the government itself. Cool. Now, what is embezzlement? It is essentially abusing your office to steal from the company. So in this case, let's say Petróleos de Venezuela entrusts you with $1,000 to do things for the company. But if you instead decide to steal that money or a portion of that money, you are committing the crime of embezzlement. Now, several public officials of Petróleos de Venezuela decided to embezzle around $200 million US. In addition to that, these officials decided to launder the proceeds of that embezzlement through Julius Bär, probably using several different layers of shell companies and other money laundering vehicles, but the money ended up in accounts from Julius Bär, which by law is required to perform what we know as KYC, or know your client, know your customer. And they didn't. KYC is legally mandated compliance policies that require banks to figure out with whom they are doing business. Essentially, you go to a bank and they have to ask you who you are, what you do. They have to look at you physically. They probably visit your offices to ensure that you're not a criminal, that the money doesn't come from illicit activities. They obviously failed to do this in the case of the Venezuelan public officials, and they helped them launder money. Now, because of these lax measures in due diligence or KYC, Julius Bär was able to launder about $17 million US for public officials from Venezuela. And this happened mostly because Julius Bär compensates their employees based on performance. So it's sort of like paying commission. If you work for this bank, most of the money that you make, most of your salary comes from a fraction of the money that you help the bank earn. So the employees are heavily incentivized to take on any and all business, irrespective of from where the money comes. The sanctions imposed on Julius Bär have to do with the following. They have been mandated to restructure their management, which is just a fancy way of saying you have to fire your board, the entire board of directors, or most of the board of directors, and replace them with good, honest people. Maybe. They have to enhance their compliance program, which essentially means a compliance program, is a set of policies, rules, processes, procedures, protocols, and all that good stuff within a company that allows you to avoid crime. Obviously, their compliance, the compliance program at Julius Bär wasn't enough, and the Swiss authorities have ordered them to enhance that compliance program. So essentially, to beef it up, to make it better. They have also been imposed a monitorship. If you recall from previous episodes, a monitor is a person that answers to the government, answers to the regulator, but that is paid by the company. And the work that the monitor does is essentially oversee the company. The monitor is inserted in the company. Everybody in the company, in this case Julius Bär, has to account to the monitor, and the monitor in turn accounts to the government. So it's sort of like a government-sponsored mole, but it's paid for by the company itself. And it bears mention that Julius Bär was imposed no financial sanctions. So even though all of these measures will cost them dearly, probably these things aren't cheap, but they weren't imposed a fine. Again, this by itself is not necessarily bad, but it could by itself be a reflection of other acts of corruption. Again, it's too early to say. Moving on to the case. Now, since we started doing the rundown of Transparency International's list of the most corrupt cases, several things happened. We got the Airbus settlement, which was huge, and a little before that, earlier was the Ericsson settlement, the Ericsson case, which was, again, by our standards, a huge amount of money, but not as big as the $4 billion imposed on Airbus. Nevertheless, let's talk about it. Now, what happened? Most of you know Ericsson as a provider of telecom technology. And that's what they do, but they don't only provide consumer electronics, they also provide communications and telecom technology to governments. And in 2019, they were imposed a $1 billion sanction in the context of a deferred prosecution agreement, or sometimes called DPA. Coolio. What's a DPA? You get, under US law, in the US legal system, you have the opportunity of obviously going to trial. For criminal trials, you can go to trial and maybe be defeated, or you can negotiate with the state's attorney's office, which is absolutely legal, and it saves costs and sometimes is more efficient. This is a very relied upon tool in FCPA prosecutions in major corruption cases in the US. Again, because it saves time and it's less painful for everyone involved. Now, the crimes to which Ericsson admitted were conspiracy to commit several other crimes. Recall that conspiracy means that two or more people get together to commit a crime, to plan or commit a crime. The crimes to which they conspired were foreign bribery, which is going out of your country to pay a bribe, violation of the books and records provisions of the FCPA, essentially going out of the country, paying bribes, and hiding that in your accounting, lying in your accounting books to reflect that those payments were not made for bribes, but they were rather, you tell whatever lie you want. And finally, lacking a compliance program. Under the FCPA, every company that is subject to the FCPA has to have a compliance program, a set of rules, procedures, policies, and all that good stuff that allows them to avoid corrupt acts. If your program is not good enough, or if essentially if you commit bribery, then that necessarily must mean that your compliance program is not good enough. So you may very easily be charged with that crime. Now, what happened? Over 17 years and in 5 different countries, Ericsson created slush funds. You might remember slush funds from different episodes, from another episode. Think of slush funds as a cash bag or a coffer into which you save money that you are later going to use for corrupt or illicit purposes, right? Now, Ericsson was charged with creating slush funds of amounting up to $84 million to use to pay bribes in Djibouti, in China, in Vietnam, Indonesia, and Kuwait. Again, all of these countries have different legal systems, but they all dealt with Ericsson in the capacity of a vendor or a public contractor, and in each country, Ericsson paid bribes to public officials to get access or get easier access to government contracts. The sanctions imposed on Ericsson are the following. They have to retain and maintain a monitor for 3 years. We already talked about what a monitor is. They have to pay fine, and they have to pay 2 fines. The first one to the Department of Justice, which is essentially the United States Prosecutor General, and they have to pay to the DOJ a fine of $520 million. In addition to that, they have to pay to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission of the US, a fine of $540 million. Recall that the DOJ administers the criminal aspects of the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is the US's law against corruption, and the SEC manages or administers the civil aspect of the law. So one of these, most of the time, these settlements are signed simultaneously, and they broach the topic of criminal violations and civil violations at the same time. In total, they paid around $1 billion, a little over $1 billion in fines. Okay, let's move on to the typology. And today, again, we will talk about art. Now, this is a money laundering typology. Recall that money laundering is taking illegal funds and passing them off as legal money. Cool. Now, what happens here is you might have heard in the news about pieces of art like this one, a banana duct taped to a wall, and it sold for around $100,000. It's interesting because for several of these pieces of art, mostly installations, when you buy them, you don't buy the actual piece of art, but you rather buy a license from the author, from the artist himself or herself, to reproduce that piece of art with your own materials and call that an original. So again, you don't buy the art, you buy a license. Now, these licenses are not regulated, so that means that you can buy as many as you want or as many as you can afford. And in return for your cash, you get a teeny tiny piece of paper that says, you have my permission to do my art, if that's a thing. Now, how would you use that to launder money? Easily, you pay the artist in cash. And again, no limitation as to how many licenses you can buy. So you could buy, to be, ridiculous, you could buy 10 licenses for the same exact piece of art, and you can pay for them in cash, bearing in mind the regulations for your country for cash payments. And you don't actually have to install those pieces of art. If the regulator comes by and the authorities ask you about where your cash went, you can simply say, well, I paid for some art. And when they ask where that art is, you just show them the license and explain to them that you haven't gotten around to making the installations, or you could actually fake them because they are relatively cheap to make. And essentially you have inserted a large amount of money into the financial system, which is the most basic definition of money laundering. So be wary whenever you hear about artists who are suddenly very prolific or very successful, because that doesn't mean that they are necessarily laundering money, but it might mean that they are into some shady stuff. So beware. And that's it for today. Thank you for joining us as always. I will remind you to blow the whistle. Please denounce every act of corruption that you encounter, but do so safely. If you're not sure whether or not what you're looking at is corruption, or you're not sure that your physical safety is guaranteed, don't do anything, refrain from acting, and reach out to people who might be able to help you. You feel free to reach out to us at info@streiner.mx, and we will be glad to help you. But above all, please stay safe. Again, this was The Wife of Caesar. My name is Michel Levien, or Michel Levien, either's fine, and you have a happy Monday.